Welcome back to The World This Week. The repeal of Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act in the United States on Tuesday has provoked controversy in American political circles, signaling as it does the end to a key provision in federal law designed to empower African American voters and prevent manipulation of voting laws by states seeking to disenfranchise minority groups. The Supreme Court ruled that Section 4 was unconstitutional, saying it has no relevance in today's more diverse and tolerant US society. Here's Alex MacDonald with more.
On Tuesday, a long-cherished piece of civil rights legislation was struck down by the Supreme Court. Section 4 of the 1965 Voting Rights Act has been removed, which originally forced 15 states wishing to change their voting rules to apply to Washington for permission. The Voting Rights Act was originally introduced in 1965 with the intention of breaking up the Jim Crow laws, which had for decades disenfranchised African Americans.
My father had a master's degree, but in the South, he didn't have protected voting rights. So when we talk about this history of voting rights, I'm born in '63. That means in my lifetime, this is not some ancient history. It's only been in my lifetime that we've had the protections of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. After the Civil War, something phenomenal happened called fusion politics, unique to the South. Lincoln Republicans joined with former slaves or freedmen to rewrite constitutions all over the South. Since 1776, when North Carolina was a state, we have never had voter ID. We've had something called signature attestation. You sign your name, and if you lie, you get a 5-year felony. That's sufficient. Jim Crow said, read the Constitution backward. Jim Crow says, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? Jim Crow says, was your grandfather a slave? James Crow Esquire comes along in a suit, gets a computer, goes in the back room, and very slyly uses a computer module and uses the geographic information on race to divide and undermine not only black power. Poor people can't compete with the rich lobbyists, so they have to have access to the ballot in order to shape the balance of power.
Some have argued that power has already shifted. More African Americans than ever are registered to vote, and with a black president in the White House, conservatives have argued that the act is out of date and unfairly penalizes a select number of states such as Texas and Alabama. With ever more ethnic minorities in positions of power in government, business and the media, it has been argued that the kind of positive discrimination that the Voting Rights Act promotes is no longer necessary or relevant. According to Chief Justice Roberts, Section 4 is based on 40-year-old facts having no logical relationship to the present day. The repeal of Section 4 could be seen as a victory for states' rights over big government, or more evidence that America is still a long way from shaking off its old obsession. Alex MacDonald, Islam Channel.
Well, joining me to discuss this in the studio is Zita Holborn from Black Activists Rising Against Cuts, Dr. Bruce Baker, a senior lecturer in US history at Royal Holloway University, and from Washington, D.C. by telephone, Horace Cooper, co-chair of Project 21, the national leadership network of black conservatives. Welcome to the program. Let me start with you, Dr. Bruce Baker. Reconstruction after the liberation of the slaves in the 19th century reversed a lot of the progress that had been made, and it then took another 100 years to get back to where we had been in 1865. What is happening now? Is there a new reconstruction? Are these southern states clawing back the rights that they were forced to give by the civil rights movement to blacks in the 60s and 70s?
Well, I think so to a great extent. Really, Reconstruction refers to the progress that was made in the dozen years after the Civil War. And one of the key things that happened was in 1870, Congress passed the 15th Constitutional Amendment, and that guaranteed the right to vote despite race, color, or previous condition, that is to say, whether or not someone had been enslaved previously. And part of that constitutional amendment authorized Congress to enforce that right through appropriate legislation. But the amendment passes in 1870, and Reconstruction, the period of time when the former slaves were given political rights and held real power, was already starting to wind down a little bit. So Congress didn't pass anything like the Voting Rights Act, and then in the years after Reconstruction, we see segregation and disfranchisement through all sorts of various ways. And eventually, the Voting Rights Act is passed in 1965 to really put into practice what was started during Reconstruction. So to get rid of it does risk taking us back to a time when African Americans, and not to say just African Americans, but any group in society with less power and less resource, who might be not the favored group, would have a much more difficult time participating in the political process.
Well, let's put that point to Horace Cooper in Washington. You heard what Dr. Baker was saying. Aren't our rights really good enough for blacks at the moment in the United States for it to be quite safe for this kind of Supreme Court decision to be taken?
Well, I guess one would have to wonder what the measures of achievement might look like. Would they look like an unprecedented number of elected officials nationwide, at mayor's offices, as governors, as senators, or heaven forbid, even the presidency of the United States? If those objective measures are being looked at, one would say that success has occurred in a way that is essentially unimaginable. I actually wonder, when will we see a member of the minority elected in the UK, in France, or in Germany?
Well, that's a fair point, but what we're trying to concentrate on more is the position in the United States. I mean, isn't there a risk that the predominantly white southern states, which have a long history of, and still fly the Confederate flag and all this sort of stuff, won't they try and claw back the progress that they were forced to make in the 60s and 70s?
Yeah, I think that's a myth, and that's part of the reason why this case resulted. My organization actually filed an amicus brief asking the Supreme Court to strike down the misuse and abuse of the Voting Rights Act, not its entirety, but those provisions that were allowing the federal government to micromanage the decisions of 9 states and a couple dozen counties because of what had happened 40 or 50 years ago. You don't continue sending the police to investigate the bank robberies from 50 years ago. You don't frisk all the people that come into the bank that it was robbed 50 years ago. You go to where the new crimes are occurring. This Justice Department under Eric Holder was abusing that authority by continuing to pretend that the problems that existed in the 1950s and 60s still exist in 2013. And there's just no evidence of that, and that's exactly what the Supreme Court said.
Well, I'd like to come to one of our guests here in London, Zita Hulbert. Do you feel comfortable in seeing the Supreme Court in the United States passing this decision?
No, I think it's atrocious that it's happened. If something works and it's protecting people against discrimination, you don't get rid of it, you keep it there as a safeguard, even in the event that you think actually things have moved on and they've changed. Why are you going to take something away that provides protection? There's still huge discrimination in the USA. Having a black president doesn't take away that discrimination. And I speak to activists regularly in the USA, in different states all over the USA, who talk about the same issues we're facing here in the UK in terms of the disproportionate impact of austerity on black people, the deprivation, the increased poverty, discrimination in all aspects of life and society.
Well, Horace Cooper, I mean, it's in about 6 weeks' time. It'll be the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's March on Washington, his famous speech at the Lincoln Memorial. I mean, do you really feel comfortable that enough progress has been made and that you really think things have changed so dramatically?
Well, see, you can't have it actually both ways. You can either say that the Voting Rights Act and the efforts like it have been largely successful in pushing forward and making progress, or you can go through the litany that the speaker just said of all the existing problems, and then it tells you that perhaps these measures have nothing to do with those changes. But you can't have it both ways. I live in this country. I happen to know there is no state in the country where it is illegal to engage in business investments or any housing opportunities that I might desire. There is no formal efforts on the part of government to prevent black Americans or any other group of Americans from being able to take advantage of the opportunities that exist here.
Well, Bruce Baker, I mean, do you think that the Supreme Court really is trying to turn the clock back, or is this just a technical decision, in fact?
I think that in situations like this, it's rarely as simple as simply turning the clock back 50 years. And I would say that Mr. Cooper is right that this is not specifically targeted now against black Americans. I would say that it's targeted more against the poor and disfranchised, who happen for historical reasons to be disproportionately people of color. But the measures that we're seeing about voter ID cards to combat a mythical problem of voter fraud places burdens on everybody who has difficulty getting to the places where you have to go to get these voter IDs, paying the fees. Is the kind of thing that comfortable white middle class or comfortable black middle class, comfortable Hispanic middle class people in the United States wouldn't think twice about, wouldn't understand why it's difficult. But if you're poor, old, unwell, depending on friends and neighbors to drive you around and get you to the driving license place to get your photo ID so that you can vote, then this becomes a tremendous burden.
But have those state laws never been taken to the Supreme Court to strike down or uphold?
They didn't have to be taken to the Supreme Court until this week because the Voting Rights Act stopped them before they started. That's the nature of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was the pre-clearance. So basically, the Voting Rights Act said, look, these states, and it's not just the South. It was some other counties outside the South restricting the voting rights of Native Americans as well. But these states and jurisdictions have a long history of tinkering with voting rights so that in order for people to vote, they had to bring lawsuits.
But one of the things is that if you've been in jail, you cannot vote after that, isn't that right? Convicted felons or something cannot vote?
That varies from state to state, and as does most voting issues in the United States. That's one of the key things about the Voting Rights Act, is that it federalized enforcement of voting rights. So it turned a patchwork of restrictions and limitations and special clauses and conditions and governed them all by one federal law. And I think that to a great extent, when we look at the bigger picture beyond just this week's ruling on this issue, I think that that's the direction that the Roberts Court is going, is simply weakening federal oversight of all issues and returning more and more power back to states and localities, which works well for the people in those places who already have power. But for the people on the margins, it makes life increasingly difficult.
Lindsay Ullman, I mean, that's your experience too, from what you know of the United States and so on, that it is, you know, the law is not enough. There has to be more than that to get people their rights.
Definitely. So if you take away the law, then that's going to weaken people's ability to, you know, stand up and fight discrimination. And I think there is an age factor as well, because I understand there are a lot of people, older people in America, who may not have ID. And what some of the states are saying is that you've got to produce that identification and get it within a couple of months, which may not be possible because of the cost and because of the administration, the process you've got to go through. And that's going to stop people from participating. I think it's going to put people off if they think they have to go and get certain ID. And also if there's changes, there's differences rather between different states. I understand there's difficulties if people move from one state to another, that might bar and restrict them from voting. So I think it's an absolute disgrace, and I understand that Reverend Al Sharpton has said that actually what this has done is smashed Martin Luther King's dream. And here in the UK, my organisation, Barrack, has planned a campaign for this year called MLK 50, Equality in Our Lifetime, and we're asking, has the dream been achieved here in the UK or in the USA? And we know the answer to that is no. And we're creating a national dialogue on race and racism here in the UK and wider about what we can do to put race back on the agenda. And I think that's what's happening with this. It's taking race off the political agenda. It's saying, actually, we're in a post-racial society where we don't need to address racism, and that's not true. Actually, under austerity, racism is increasing.
Well, Horace Cooper back in the United States from Washington, I mean, this point that was raised about federal IDs being required before you can vote and so on, isn't that Shouldn't that be struck down? Why should they put in all these...
I guess I'd like to make a couple of quick points. I'm not going to opine on equality in the UK, but I can focus on what I do know. And that is that the Supreme Court in 2006 already examined the question of voter ID in a case involving the state of Indiana. In that particular case, a lot of the so-called progressive interest groups weighed in, and they lost. And the decision was written by one of the progressives on the court that on its face, a voter ID requirement is not per se unconstitutional. This brings me to my second point. There are specific issues that caused this ruling to come about. The Voting Rights Act was never intended to redress income minorities. It was never intended to address age-based minorities. If you see injustice happening and you try to use the Voting Rights Act as a tool to address those injustices outside of the race-based context, you're going to lose the case. And that is what the Justice Department had been attempting to do. They had been abusing the authority of preclearance for events unrelated to race-based voter intimidation. The court said, we'll still let you have that power, but at least if you're going to exercise it, you have to use modern data points to substantiate that.
But how do you deal with the point that Zita Holborn made? I mean, a general point that there is a sort of move by conservatives like yourself, mainly conservatives, not entirely, but mainly, to sort of imply that racism is a thing of the past. Look, we've got a black president and so on. It's all over now. Of course, there's socioeconomic problems, but racism is dead and buried in America. I mean, do you agree with that point?
Racism is not the number 1, 2, 3, or 10, or even 100th problem addressing America. Largely, economic opportunity is the number 1 issue. We have significant issues with privacy. There are a number of other issues of government providing too many incentives for people and displacing the ability of the free market. But to say simply that the big problem in the United States, there simply are no independent measures of the kind that the drafters of the Voting Rights Act or of the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment contemplated that aren't true today.
No, but economic opportunity depends on where you were born, what kind of school you went to, who your parents were, and so on. You can't pretend that everybody's absolutely equal from when they're born, except in terms of human rights and the right to rights.
That may be true in the UK, but that's not true here. We have a Forbes 500 in which we list the wealthiest families and households every year, and you can see over a 10-year period those numbers change dramatically. Only during economic downturns do you see a stasis in that. We have a very dynamic economy, and it is possible for people to come from very, very modest outcomes to very, very successful outcomes. Bill Gates and the founders of Google are good examples of that.
Well, Bruce Baker, looking at sort of U.S. history, would you say that the sort of tide of racism is really now ebbing fast and it's mainly just socioeconomic issues?
Well, I would say certainly it's better than it used to be. I grew up in South Carolina, and I can say, certainly my friends and family back there, it is a much less racist place than it was. But in a lot of ways, I think this has made us and made people in the United States far too complacent and not concerned and think just because we have some very successful, very prominent people of color, just because we have a president whose father was African and therefore is considered black by most people, that therefore racism is not a problem. And I think that it does still continue to be by any measure. One of the things that Mr. Cooper said, I think, conflates a couple of things about the Voting Rights Act. And that is that the evidence of racial discrimination does not have to be tied to an intent to discriminate. So it's not about the intention, it's about the result. And I think when we look at a lot of these laws that have now been cleared for enforcement by this week's ruling, we see a result of racial discrimination, even if there's not on the face of it any intent to discriminate racially.
Well, it's race and class have merged much more. I mean, what you were saying about your own family in South Carolina and so on, there is now a much bigger black middle class.
Yeah,
and obviously Barack Obama and his wife are representatives of that. But there's still a huge underclass of blacks who go in disproportionate numbers to jail, who go disproportionately to rotten schools and so on. Isn't that the case?
Yes, and also, and not just black people in America, Hispanic people in much of the country as well, disproportionately lacking the opportunities that other groups of people have.
So what's the way to combat it? What's the way to get change?
Well, in the first place, they shouldn't have done what they did unless they had something stronger to put in place. I understand from activists in the USA that there are going to be protests and demonstrations and action taking place. And I think, to draw wider awareness, that needs to happen. But until you have an equal society, then you need protection in law, in policies, in actions and attitudes to protect people from that discrimination, to safeguard against it, to challenge discrimination and fight discrimination that exists, but actually to try and create a more equal society at the same time.
Well, you mentioned MLK 50,
yes,
and I did also mention the 50th anniversary coming up. Mr. Cooper, is there going to be some kind of 50th anniversary thing in Washington for the I Have a Dream speech?
I would anticipate that we're going to see quite a bit to commemorate. As many of you know, there's a monument that was dedicated last year. But I want to reiterate, we have to be careful about comparing systems. The American system has no constitutional requirement that people of a certain age or people of a certain income must, quote, be given special assistance and protection. In America, we have a much more competitive and dynamic process. What the Voting Rights Act does is says in a narrow area, race you may not use. And when government, whether under Mr. Obama or anyone else, tries to use the race tool to address broader socioeconomic concerns, they shouldn't be surprised when the court rules against them. That's how this case arose.
But it is a conservative court. It's the John Roberts Court, appointed by George Bush. Most of the justices were appointed by conservative presidents, weren't they?
As I mentioned, when the voter ID law came, Mr. Roberts was nowhere to be seen on the court, and that decision was written by Mr. Stevens, a very, very progressive member of the court. He's subsequently retired, yet he understood that there was a legal principle at work. There was no actual bar in the Constitution on this provision on voter ID. Why would Eric Holder, as the Justice Department head, start telling states like South Carolina and Texas, I know the rest of the country can do it, you can't have voter ID. I'm using the Voting Rights Act authority to stop you from doing it. You get a cognitive dissonance that the court has to address.
But this is classic. This is the classic argument. So-called states' rights was constantly used by the southern states to block any kind of federal legislation to bring about human rights. So states' rights is just a smokescreen for conservatism, isn't it?
I think that's funny. That's almost like saying the rights of the parliament are just a smokescreen for allowing the crown to continue carrying out the policies that it had for 100 or 200 years. My point here is the principle involved in the Voting Rights Act was one that came about more than 111 years ago, and it was a simple matter. Could a state change its state capital, whether or not it had that authority? And there have been a number of rulings that have flown from that. That had nothing to do with oppression, that had nothing to do with mistreatment. It was a very, very simple matter of law.
Okay, well, thank you. You explained it very well. I'm afraid we've run out of time. Thank you very much for coming on and giving us your point of view. And thank you, Bruce Baker and Zita Holborn here in London. And thank you all for watching.